For 20 years, they laughed at the way I said thank you for coming, the soft roll of it, the music my mother gave me. They called me the village girl who trapped their son with a plate of jollof rice and a pretty face. My sister-in-law stood up at the anniversary gala, lifted her champagne, and told 300 people I had never owned a single thing in my life. And I let her finish. I let her smile. Then I asked the lawyer at table 4 to please read out, slowly, whose name was printed on the deed. You should have seen the room go quiet. You should have seen her face when she understood that the floor she was standing on had belonged to me all along. But to understand how things reached that point, we need to go back 20 years, to the day a frightened young woman first walked into a cold house on Voltron Hill, the day that split her life into before and after. Her name was Marvella Okafor, and she was 23 years old the first time she set foot in the Beaumont house. She remembered the cold most of all, not the weather, the house itself. The marble in the entry hall was the color of bone, and her footsteps echoed up a curving staircase as if the building wanted her to know how small she was. There were portraits on the walls, oil paintings of Beaumonts going back 4 generations, all of them with the same long, pale face and the same expression, as though they had each smelled something faintly unpleasant and were too well-bred to mention it. Marvella stood under those painted eyes in her best dress, a green wax print her aunt had sewn by hand, and she felt every thread of it announce that she did not belong. Roland had promised her it would be fine. Roland promised many things, gently in that low, warm voice that had undone her completely 2 years earlier in Lagos, where he had been a junior partner sweating through a trade conference, and she had been the caterer's niece who refilled his water glass and told him, laughing, that he looked like a man who had never eaten properly in his life. He had laughed back. He had come the next day, and the next. Roland Beaumont, heir to a restaurant empire he never talked about, falling for a girl with flour permanently under her nails. It had felt like a fairy tale, and Marvella, who was not a foolish woman, had let herself believe in it anyway, because love makes fools of even the careful ones. The fairy tale ended at the foot of that staircase where his mother was waiting. Vivian Beaumont did not embrace her. She looked at Marvella the way an appraiser looks at a stone someone has tried to pass off as a diamond, a long, patient look that took in the dress, the suitcase, the nervous hands. Then she turned to her son and said, in French, something quick and low, and Roland's ears went red, and he did not translate it. Marvella did not need the translation. She had grown up reading faces in a kitchen full of aunts. She understood that she had just been weighed and found cheap. "Welcome to the family," Vivian said in English, and her smile was a beautiful thing, white and even and entirely without warmth. That word would follow Marvella for 20 years. Useful. She married Roland 3 weeks later in a registry office because Vivian had made it clear there would be no church, no celebration, nothing the photographers covered. A Beaumont marrying a Nigerian caterer was not a thing one announced. It was a thing one quietly arranged and hoped the world would forget. Marvella wore the green dress again. She had no one of her own there. Her aunt could not get a visa in time, and her mother had passed 2 winters before. So she stood beside this pale, serious man in a borrowed country and signed her name and tried to believe she was building a life. And, in a strange way, she did. Because here is the thing the Beaumonts never understood about the girl they brought into their cold house. Marvella Okafor did not know how to be small. She had been raised loud, raised in a kitchen where 40 people were fed on the strength of one woman's wrists, where you sang while you cooked, and you fed strangers because that was simply what decent people did. She arrived in their world expecting nothing, so she went looking for work to do, and she found it in the one room of the Beaumont empire that no one in that family actually cared about, the kitchen. The restaurant was called Beaumont's, and it sat on the corner of Aldwyn and Ferris like an old king. Dark wood, white cloth, a brass plaque by the door so worn from decades of hands that the name had nearly rubbed away. It had been founded in 1953 by Roland's grandfather, a hard man named Augustine, who had built it from a single rented room into the kind of place where city councilmen proposed to their wives and signed their crooked deals over the same 40-year-old wine list. By the time Marvella married into the family, Beaumont's was less a restaurant than a monument, beautiful, prestigious, and slowly, quietly dying. The menu had not changed in 15 years. The chef was 68 and tired. The dining room was still full on Fridays out of pure habit, but the habit was thinning, and everyone in the family could feel it, even if no one would say it out loud. No one would say it out loud, that is, except Marvella. She started accidentally. 6 months into the marriage, restless in a house that had no use for her, she came to the restaurant on a slow Tuesday and asked the old chef, Monsieur Lascelles, if she might just watch. He had grunted, which she took for yes. By the end of the night, she had quietly fixed a sauce that had been breaking for the better part of a decade, a knot of butter and a flick of acid, the kind of instinct you cannot teach, and Lascelles had looked at her with something close to fear. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My grandmother's compound. We didn't have your butter. We had to make everything taste like more than it was." He let her come back. Then he let her cook. Within 2 years, the woman the Beaumonts called the village girl was running the back of the house at the most prestigious restaurant in the city, and the family had no idea, because the family never went into the kitchen. Vivian would not have soiled her shoes. Celestine, Roland's younger sister, 26 and elegant and ferociously ambitious, managed the front-of-house experience, which meant she chose the flowers and flirted with the investors and took the credit. Roland sat in an office upstairs and signed whatever his mother and sister put in front of him. And Marvella cooked. She cooked, and the dying restaurant began, quietly, to live again. She knew enough to be invisible about it. She understood with the clear, cold instinct of a woman who has been told her whole life that she is decoration, that the moment her contribution became visible, it would become threatening. So she let Celestine take the praise when the new menu got written up in the city paper. She let Vivian tell the investors that the family's renewed commitment to excellence had turned the numbers around. She fed them their own credit on a silver plate, and she kept her head down, and she did the work, year after year after year, and she told herself that one day it would be enough. One day they would see her. They never did. That was her great mistake, and she would not understand it fully for 2 decades. She kept trying to earn a place at a table that had decided on the day she walked in that she would never be allowed to sit. There was one wound deeper than all the others, and the Beaumonts pressed on it whenever they could find it. Marvella could not have children. She had wanted them. God, she had wanted them, with a hunger that surprised her, a hunger that had grown in the quiet of that loveless house until it ached. She and Roland had tried for years. There were doctors and there were tests, and there was a single terrible afternoon in a clinic with gray carpet where a kind man explained, gently, that it was unlikely, that her body had been shaped by a childhood illness no one had treated in time, that she should perhaps make peace with it. She had wept in the car for an hour. Roland had patted her hand and looked out the window and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only language Roland was truly fluent in. Vivian found out, of course. Vivian found out everything, and from that day the word useful was joined by a second and crueler one, spoken always with a sad little smile, always in front of people, always too softly to be challenged. Barren. "It's a shame," Vivian would murmur to a guest at dinner, glancing at Marvella across the table. "A man like Roland, no heir, the family name simply ends. But what can one do?" A sad smile, a sip of wine, and Marvella would sit there with her face composed and her hands folded and feel the small stones strike, and then another and another, pebbles thrown one by one, each one small enough to deny, all of them together a slow burial. And Roland, her husband, the man who had crossed an ocean of his mother's disapproval to marry her, said nothing. He looked at his plate. He looked out the window. His silence was a door he closed in her face 1,000 times, and she did not yet understand that one day he would close it for the last time. 20 years. Marvella gave them 20 years. And then came the night of the spring banquet, and the family found a new way to break her, and this time they meant for it to be the last. It was meant to be a celebration. The restaurant had just been valued, formally, for the first time in a generation, ahead of what Vivian called some changes to the family structure, and the appraisal had come back high, staggeringly high, far higher than anyone had expected. Beaumont's was suddenly worth a fortune, and the family wanted to mark the moment with a private dinner. Investors, a city councilman, 2 journalists from the society pages, and a guest of honor whose presence Marvella did not understand until it was too late. His name was Anton Reyes, and he owned 11 restaurants across 3 cities, and he was, Vivian announced to the table with great warmth, a very dear new friend of the family. Marvella was not seated at the head of the table. She was seated, as always, near the end, beside an empty chair, and she had cooked every course coming out of that kitchen with her own hands, and not one person in that room knew it. She watched Celestine rise to give a toast in a column of silver silk, watched her lift her glass, watched her smile go bright and sharp as a knife. To family, Celestine said, to blood, to the people who built this place, and to the exciting future ahead. Her eyes found Marvella down the table and held there, and the smile widened. And of course, she added lightly, to a ripple of laughter, to the help. Where would any of us be without the help? The laughter was the worst part. It was so easy for them. Marvella felt her face heat, and she kept it still. She kept it still. 20 years of practice keeping it still. But Vivian was not finished. Vivian never let a wound go unworked. "My daughter is too kind," the old woman said, rising now herself, and the table hushed for the matriarch. "Marvella has been a fixture here for 20 years. She let the word fixture sit there, a thing you might say about a coat rack. And I think it's only right, with the family entering a new chapter, that we be honest with ourselves about what each person contributed. Roland gave us his name. Celestine gave us her vision." She turned slowly and looked down the long table at the woman in the green dress. "And Marvella gave us..." The pause. The cruel, surgical pause. "Well, she tried, didn't she? The poor thing tried." And Roland, Marvella's husband, the man whose sauce she had fixed, whose family she had fed, whose dying business she had quietly raised from the dead over 2 decades of silent labor, Roland looked at his plate. He picked up his fork, and he said nothing. Something in Marvella's chest, a thing that had been holding 20 years of weight, finally, quietly, broke. She did not cry. She did not stand and shout, though the words were there, hot and ready in her throat. She simply sat in the laughter and let it close over her head like cold water. And somewhere, far down inside, in a room she had never let anyone see, a different woman opened her eyes. Useful, she thought. Barren, the help, a fixture, the poor thing who tried. She had spent 20 years trying to make these people love her. She would never make that mistake again. She still did not know that night how far back their plan against her already went. She did not know that the appraisal, the dinner, the very dear new friend with 11 restaurants, that none of it was a coincidence. She thought she was being humiliated. She did not yet understand that she was being removed. The papers came 4 days later. Roland brought them himself, which was somehow worse than if a lawyer had. He found her in the kitchen at the restaurant on a gray Tuesday morning, her sleeves pushed up, breaking down a delivery of fish, and he stood in the doorway in his good coat looking like a man who had come to put down a dog he had grown fond of. He had a leather folder under his arm. He would not meet her eyes. "Marvella," he said, "we need to talk about the business." She set down her knife. She wiped her hands on her apron, slowly, watching him. "There's a restructuring. Mother and Celestine, and the accountants, it's all the accountants, really. They've been advising us that the family's holdings need to be more clean for the sale, for the future." He swallowed. "Your involvement here, it was never formalized, you understand. There was never actual paperwork making you a part of the business, legally. You were more of a family helper. A family helper. 20 years. "So we just need you to sign these," Roland said, opening the folder, sliding papers across the steel counter toward her, careful not to let his fingers touch hers. "It just acknowledges that you have no claim. It protects everyone. It protects you, actually, from any liability if the sale goes through." He tried to smile. It died on his face. Celestine drew them up. She said it's standard. She said it's just protecting the family. She said it's just protecting the family. He believed it, too. That was the thing about Roland that Marvella understood in that frozen moment more clearly than she had understood anything in 20 years. He was not the architect of her ruin. He did not have the spine for architecture. He was a man who signed what his mother and sister put in front of him and called it peace. His cruelty was not in scheming against her. His cruelty was that he had never once in 20 years stood between her and the people who did. Marvella looked down at the papers. The language swam. Waiver of claim, acknowledgement of non-ownership. The undersigned affirms she holds no legal interest in Beaumont's restaurant or any associated entity, license, or property. Celestine's neat signature was already at the bottom of one page, witnessing. Vivian's was on another. And Marvella, who was not a foolish woman, who had spent 20 years being underestimated by people too proud to look closely, Marvella felt the cold room go very quiet and very clear, because there was something none of them knew. There was something she had done 18 years ago on a tired afternoon in the second year of her marriage when old Monsieur Lascelles was retiring and the restaurant's ancient business license had come up for its decennial renewal and the family had been too busy with a society wedding to deal with the tedious paperwork, and Celestine had shoved the renewal forms at Marvella with a flick of her wrist. "Make yourself useful, file these," and walked away in a cloud of perfume. Marvella had filed them. Of course she had filed them. She always did what she was told. But she had read them first, because she always read everything first, and she had noticed on that tired afternoon 18 years ago that the renewal asked for the name of the license holder, and that the old license had been in Augustine's name, and Augustine was dead, and the form would simply not process without a living holder of record, and there was no one to ask, and so Marvella Okafor, 25 years old, freshly told to make herself useful, had put down the only living name she had the authority to write, her own. She had not done it to scheme. She had genuinely meant to fix it later, to tell someone, to hand the proper paperwork to Roland and have it corrected. But no one had asked. No one had cared. The license renewed, the restaurant kept running, the years rolled forward, and the document sat in a gray government office and in a copy in her own private file, a single sheet of paper that said in the dry language of the licensing authority that the legal proprietor of record for Beaumont's restaurant, the holder of the operating license without which not one plate could legally leave that kitchen, was a woman named Marvella Okafor. For 18 years it had meant nothing, a clerical accident, a thing she had half forgotten. Now, standing in the cold kitchen with her husband sliding a waiver across the steel toward her, watching him refuse to meet her eyes, Marvella understood that it meant everything. She did not tell him. She would not have told him for the world. Instead, she looked up at Roland and she let her face do the thing it had done for 20 years. She let it go soft and hurt and beaten. She let a tear come, and it was not entirely false. There was real grief in it. Grief for the 20 years and the fairy tale and the man who could have stood up and never once did. "Can I have a few days?" she said quietly. "To read them, to say goodbye to the kitchen." And Roland, relieved, so relieved that she was not going to make it difficult, nodded quickly and said, of course, take whatever time she needed. And he left the folder on the counter and fled the room like a man escaping a fire. Marvella stood alone in the kitchen she had saved. She picked up the waiver. She read every word of it slowly, the way she read everything. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and she did not sign it. It would be 3 years before she set foot in that building again, and when she did, she would not come as a family helper. She would come as the woman whose name was on the deed. That night she went home to the cold house on Vautrin Hill, and she packed one suitcase, the same suitcase she had arrived with 20 years before, scuffed now, the handle mended with tape, and she took only what was hers, her clothes, her grandmother's wooden spoon, a small folder of papers she had kept private for 18 years without ever fully knowing why. She left her wedding ring on the marble shelf in the cold entry hall under the painted eyes of 4 generations of Beaumonts, and she walked out the front door into a freezing spring rain, and she did not look back at the house, and the house, indifferent as it had always been, did not watch her go. It was raining the night she arrived in this country 20 years before, frightened and hopeful in a green dress. It was raining the night she left. She stood on the pavement with the cold coming through her coat, and she felt beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, beneath the 20 wasted years, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt free. She had $400, a suitcase, a wooden spoon, and a secret folded in an old folder. She had no children, no family in this country, no home, and no idea yet how cruel and how planned the thing that had been done to her truly was. But she could cook. God, could she cook. And she knew this city's appetite better than anyone alive because she had spent 20 years feeding it in the dark while other people took the bow. The rain came down. Marvella Okafor picked up her suitcase and she walked toward the lights of the city, and somewhere in the dark behind her, in a warm, bright house full of laughing people, the family that had thrown her away was already toasting to a future they were certain belonged to them. They had no idea what they had just put out on the street. 3 years passed. They were not gentle years, and Marvella would not pretend later that they had been. The first months were the hardest of her life, harder than the cold house, harder than the laughter at the table. She slept the first 2 weeks in a women's hostel on the east side, in a narrow bed in a room with 5 other women, and she lay awake listening to strangers breathe and asked herself in the dark whether she had been mad to walk away from 20 years. But Marvella was raised by a woman who fed 40 people on the strength of her wrists, and a woman like that does not lie down. In the 3rd week, she found work, not glamorous work, line work, the graveyard shift at a diner that served truckers and night nurses off the ring road, a steel galley run by a tired Greek man named Stavros who paid in cash and did not ask questions. She took it. She worked the 4 a.m. rush, she made the truckers' eggs and the night nurses' coffee, and when Stavros wasn't looking, she fixed his sauces the way she'd fixed Lascelles 20 years before, and the regulars started coming back, and Stavros started watching her the way the old chef had, with something close to fear. "Where did you learn that?" he asked her one night. "My grandmother's compound and a cold house on a hill. I'll tell you about the hill someday." She saved. God did she save. She had learned that much from 20 years of watching the Beaumonts hoard. She set aside a fixed portion of every cash envelope the moment it touched her hand, before she paid for anything, before she let herself want anything, the way you tithe, the way you build a wall, one careful stone at the time. She moved out of the hostel into a single room above a laundromat that smelled of warm cotton and bleach, and she did not mind the smell because it was hers, the first thing in 20 years that was entirely hers. And she began, quietly, to plan. Because here is what the Beaumonts had never understood, the thing that would undo every one of them in the end. They thought they had thrown away a helper. They thought they had removed a fixture, swept out a poor, barren village girl who had outlived her usefulness. What they had actually done was take the single most gifted, most disciplined, most underestimated restaurateur in the city and set her free, with nothing left to lose and 20 years of stored-up fury to spend. And she still had no idea in those first hard years how far back their plan against her really went. She thought she had simply been discarded. She did not yet know about the deal with Anton Reyes. She did not yet know about the second set of documents, the ones hidden even from Roland, or whose signature was forged on them, or what the family was truly planning to sell, and to whom, and why a woman with no legal claim had needed so very badly to be made to sign a waiver. She would learn all of it, every cold, calculated line of it. But first, she had to build something of her own, and she had to do it the way she did everything, quietly, completely, and right under the noses of people too proud to look closely. It started with a single market stall. Stavros let her use the diner's kitchen on Sundays when it was closed for a cut of whatever she made, and Marvella started baking. Not the food of the cold house, not the fussy, reduced sauces and the towers of garnish the Beaumonts served to people who came to be seen rather than to eat. She baked the food of her grandmother's compound, the food of warmth and abundance, the things she had not been allowed to cook in 20 years of someone else's kitchen. Meat pies with pastry that shattered like a held breath, chin-chin and paper cones, puff-puffs still warm dusted with sugar, sold 3 for a coin to people walking to the train, and bread, dense, dark loaves studded with dates and a secret thread of cardamom, the kind of bread that made a stranger stop on the pavement and turn around and ask, almost angry, "What is that smell?" That smell became the first stone of her new life. Vanilla and dark molasses and warm cardamom drifting out of a folding table at the Saturday market on Renwick Street, where a tall Nigerian woman with flour on her hands and a steel calm in her eyes sold out of everything she made by 10 in the morning. People remembered the smell before they remembered her name, and then they remembered her name. She called the stall Okafor's, her own name, her mother's name, the name the Beaumonts had spent 20 years treating like a stain, painted now in careful gold letters on a hand-cut wooden sign, and every time a customer said it, "I'll have 2 of the date loaves, Okafor's, please," Marvella felt something straighten in her spine that had been bent for 2 decades. By the end of the first year, the stall had a line. By the middle of the second, it had outgrown the table, and she rented a narrow shop front 2 streets over, a former cobbler's with a cracked tile floor and a coal-black old oven in the back that she fired up and fell in love with. By the end of the second year, Okafor's the bakery had its own small line out the door on Saturday mornings and a write-up in the very same society paper that had once credited Celestine for Marvella's menu, except this time the photograph was of Marvella herself, arms crossed, flour on her apron, not smiling, magnificent. She did not seek the Beaumonts out. She did not need to. She knew this city, and this city talks. She knew that the write-up would reach Vivian's breakfast table, that someone would set the paper down beside the old woman's coffee with the photograph face up, and that Vivian would feel for the first time in her life a small cold finger of something she could not name. Good, Marvella thought when she let herself imagine it. Let her feel it. But she did not build Okafors for revenge. That was the thing that made her dangerous. She built it because she was good, because the work was hers, and the name was hers, and for the first time in 20 years, she went to sleep tired in the right way, the clean way, the way you sleep when the day belonged to you. The revenge, when it came, would come from a different place entirely. It would come from a letter. The letter arrived in the autumn of the 3rd year, and it changed everything. It came to the bakery, addressed in a shaking copperplate hand to Madame Marvella Okafor, and Marvella did not recognize the writing, and the postmark was from a hospice on the coast. She opened it at the back counter with floury fingers, expecting a supplier, a bill, a fan. She read it standing up, and by the 2nd paragraph she had to sit down on an upturned flour tub, and by the end she was not breathing quite right. It was from a woman named Adeline Vasseur. The name meant nothing to Marvella at first, but the letter explained, in the careful, unspooling way of the very old and the very ill, who Adeline Vasseur was. She had been for 31 years the private bookkeeper of the Beaumont family. She had kept their ledgers, their household accounts, their quiet little arrangements. She had retired 6 years ago. She was now dying. She said so plainly with no self-pity. The doctors give me until the spring, and I have made my peace, but I have not made my peace with you. I watched them do it, the old woman wrote, over years. I held the papers and I said nothing because I was a coward and I needed my position. I am no longer a coward because a coward needs a future and I have none. So I am writing to tell you what I know while I can still hold a pen, and you may do with it whatever a stronger person than I would have done long ago. What Adeline Vasseur knew was this. The plan to remove Marvella from the family had not begun 3 years ago with the appraisal and the dinner and the waiver. It had begun 11 years ago. Celestine, patient, elegant, ferociously ambitious Celestine, had understood, long before anyone else in the family, exactly what the restaurant was worth, and had understood with perfect clarity that the only obstacle between the Beaumonts and an enormous fortune was that the restaurant could not simply be sold. It could be sold to the right buyer, in the right way, for the right staggering sum, but only with the cooperation of everyone who held a stake. And Celestine did not want to share that fortune 4 ways, or even 3. She wanted it whole. So over 11 years, in increments so small that no single one of them could be noticed, Celestine had been engineering the family. She had encouraged Vivian's contempt for Marvella, fed it, sharpened it, because a despised Marvella was a Marvella who could be cut out. She had nurtured Roland's weakness, made herself indispensable to him, become the sister who handled the difficult things so her brother never had to grow a spine. And quietly, beneath all of it, she had been negotiating, for years, a private sale of Beaumont's to Anton Reyes and his 11-restaurant empire, a sale that would gut the place, strip the name off the worn brass plaque, and replace a 70-year-old institution with the 3rd location of a chain. The forged partnership documents that had cut Marvella out, the ones Roland had signed believing they merely tidied up the family's holdings, were not really about Marvella at all. Adeline had seen the originals. The waiver Marvella had been asked to sign was only the visible, lawful-looking top layer of a much deeper deception. Underneath it, in the documents Celestine kept from everyone, including her own brother, were the actual terms of the Reyes deal, and they were drawn so that the proceeds would flow, almost entirely, into a holding company that Celestine controlled alone. Vivian would get a stipend and a story about preserving the family legacy. Roland would get far less than he imagined and would be told it was the market and would believe it because Roland believed whatever Celestine told him, and Marvella would get nothing because Marvella would have signed away a claim she never knew she had. It was not random cruelty. It had never been random. The humiliation at the dinner, the word barren deployed like a scalpel year after year, the careful manufacture of a wife so despised that no one would question her removal, all of it had been construction. Marvella had spent 20 years thinking she was failing to earn their love. She had not been failing at anything. She had been the load-bearing wall in someone else's demolition, and she was supposed to be knocked out cleanly so the whole thing could come down on schedule. They did not throw you away because you were worthless, Adeline wrote in the line that Marvella would read 100 times in the weeks to come. They threw you away because you were in the way. There is a difference, and you have earned the right to know it. And then, at the very bottom of the letter, in handwriting that had grown shakier with every page, the old bookkeeper had written the thing that turned Marvella's grief into something colder and far more useful. There is one thing they do not know, Adeline wrote. I do not think even Celestine knows it, because Celestine has never once in her life imagined that the help might read what they are told to file. The sale to Reyes cannot complete. It cannot complete because the operating license, the proprietorship of record, without which the doors cannot lawfully open, was renewed 18 years ago in a name that is not Beaumont. I filed the family's tax against that license for years, and I always wondered who M. Okafor was. I assumed a clerk's error. I never corrected it because correcting it was not my place. It was never an error, was it? The whole empire, my dear, has been standing on your name this entire time. They are about to try to sell a house whose deed, in every way that matters to a court, belongs to the woman they put out in the rain. Go and take it. Marvella sat on the upturned flour tub in the back of her own bakery for a long time, the warm cardamom dark of the place around her, the letter trembling slightly in her steady hands. Outside, the Saturday line was forming. The old oven ticked, and inside her, that quiet room she had opened on the night of the spring banquet, where a different woman had woken up, filled slowly with light. She did not weep. She had done her weeping 3 years ago, in a car with gray carpet and in a hostel bed in the dark. The grief had burned down now to something hard and clear and patient. She had a name on a deed. She had a dying witness with 31 years of knowledge and a conscience and nothing left to lose. She had a buyer who did not yet know the floor was rotten beneath his feet, and a family that did not yet know the woman they had discarded was holding the one document that could unmake them all. And she had 3 years stored up fury and a bakery that had taught her she could build anything, and the patience, God, the patience of a woman who survived 20 years at a table where she was not wanted. The disturbing arithmetic of the old bookkeeper's letter would not leave her in peace. 11 years. They had been planning to bury her for 11 years, and she had spent those same 11 years fixing their sauces and swallowing their stones and trying to earn a love that was a stage set all along. She folded the letter. She put it in the old folder, beside the license, beside the unsigned waiver she had carried out of that cold kitchen 3 years before. Then Marvella Okafor stood up, washed the flour from her hands, walked to the front of her bakery, and started serving the morning line, calm, warm, unhurried, magnificent, while in the back of her mind, brick by brick, patient by patient, she began to build the thing that would bring the whole proud house down. She would need to move carefully. She would need to know everything before she did anything, and she would need, she realized, to do something that the woman of 20 years ago could never have imagined. She would need to find Celestine's enemy, because a plan this cold, run for 11 years by a woman this ruthless, had surely, somewhere along the way, made another victim. And 2 victims, Marvella was beginning to understand, are far more dangerous than one. She booked a train to the coast that very night, to a hospice that smelled of antiseptic and sea air, to sit at the bedside of a dying woman she had never met and say thank you, and to ask her one more question. The question was a name. The hospice sat on a chalk cliff above a gray sea, and Marvella arrived in the late afternoon with a paper box of date loaves under her arm because she did not know how to walk into a room empty-handed, and she did not intend to learn now. Adeline Vasseur was smaller than the letter had made her sound. She was a tiny, dry woman propped on white pillows, her hands like folded paper on the blanket, but her eyes, when they found Marvella in the doorway, were sharp and black and entirely awake. She looked at the tall Nigerian woman with the flower-calloused hands and at the box, and something moved across her ruined face that took Marvella a moment to recognize as relief. "You came," Adeline said. "I wasn't certain you would. I made you no promises, and I gave you a great deal of work." "You gave me the truth," Marvella said, sitting in the hard chair by the bed. "Nobody's given me that in 20 years. I came to say thank you." The old woman's mouth twitched. "Open the box. Let me smell it. The doctors have taken everything else. They may as well leave me my nose." So Marvella opened the box, and the warm cardamom dark of it filled the antiseptic room, and Adeline Vasseur closed her eyes and breathed it in like a woman remembering she was alive. And then, in the failing afternoon light, she told Marvella the rest of it, the parts too dangerous to commit to a letter that might be read by the wrong hands. She told her where the second set of documents was kept, not in the restaurant, not in a lawyer's office, but in a private safe deposit box in Celestine's own name at a bank on Aldous Street, because Celestine trusted no one, not even her own attorney, with the true terms of the Reyes deal. She told her the name of the notary Celestine had used to forge Roland's authorizations, a man named Pelletier, who had since fallen out with Celestine over money, and who, Adeline suspected, could be persuaded to talk to the right person with the right leverage. And she told her the date. The sale closes at the gala, the 20th anniversary gala. Celestine has built the whole evening around it. Investors, the city, the press, that man Reyes smiling in a good suit. She means to announce the new chapter to the world and have the paper signed that same night in front of everyone, so it looks like a triumph instead of a theft. She has always understood that a thing done loudly in front of important people becomes very hard to undo. People are too embarrassed to object once they have applauded. Marvella sat very still. She wants a public moment. She has always wanted a public moment. "Then I'll give her one," Marvella said. The old woman laughed, a thin, delighted, terrible sound, and reached out one paper hand, and Marvella took it and held it. "There is one more thing," Adeline said. "You asked me in your message for a name. The name of someone Celestine has also wronged. Her name is Seraphine Lowell. She was engaged to Anton Reyes for 2 years, and Celestine took him. Not for love. Celestine has never wanted a man for love in her life. She took him to close the deal because Reyes would never have signed with the family if he were not, shall we say, personally entangled with the family. Celestine seduced him as a term of the contract, and she destroyed Seraphine Lowell to do it, spread things, ruined her standing in this city so that no one would believe a word the poor woman said about any of them." Adeline's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Find Seraphine. She has been hating Celestine alone for 2 years with no proof and no power. You are about to hand her both." Marvella found Seraphine Lowell 11 days later in a far smaller and sadder apartment than a woman of her former standing should have occupied, and the meeting was not easy. Seraphine was wary, brittle, exhausted by 2 years of being disbelieved, a beautiful woman gone sharp at the edges, who opened her door only on the chain and asked flatly who Marvella was and what she wanted. "My name is Marvella Okafor," said Marvella through the gap. 3 years ago, the Beaumonts threw me into the street after 20 years. 2 years ago, they did something to you. I think it was the same hand. I think we have been hating the same woman from opposite ends of the same room. I hold up the old folder, and I think I can prove it all, but I can't do it alone, and I came to ask if you're tired of being called a liar." The chain came off the door. What followed was the part of the story Marvella would never tell anyone, not even years later. The quiet months, the careful months. 2 wronged women in a small, bright bakery after closing, building a case the way you build a wall, 1 stone at a time. Seraphine knew the world the Beaumonts moved in. She knew which journalist could not be bought and which one could be trusted. She knew how the city's appetites worked. She knew Anton Reyes well enough to know exactly how he would react when he learned he had been used as a contract term rather than chosen as a man. Seraphine had the documents, the license, the letter, the dying witness. Together they found Pelletier the notary, who, exactly as Adeline had predicted, proved very willing to talk once he understood which way the wind was about to blow, and who produced from his own protective files the forged authorizations bearing a version of Roland's signature that Roland had never made. And, quietly, through a lawyer Seraphine trusted, Marvella did the one thing that would turn the whole gala into a trap. She had the licensing authority confirm, in writing, on official paper, what had been true for 18 years and what no one in the Beaumont family had ever once thought to check. The legal proprietor of record of Beaumont's restaurant, the holder of the operating license without which the doors could not lawfully open, without which there was no business to sell, without which Anton Reyes would be buying an empty room and a worn brass plaque, was Marvella Okafor. Celestine, somewhere in those final weeks, began to sense danger. Ruthless people often do. It is the instinct that makes them ruthless. A query had been made to the licensing authority. A notary she had paid to be silent had been seen at a lawyer's office. Twice she felt watched. Once she received with no note a small paper box containing a single date loaf dusted with sugar, and she did not understand it, and she threw it away, and the not understanding frightened her more than a threat would have. She did the only thing a woman like Celestine knows how to do. She moved the closing up. She would sign at the gala as planned, but earlier in the evening, fast, before whatever was gathering in the dark could arrive, and she sent word, through a third party, to the woman she still thought of as the village girl above a laundromat, a quiet, vicious little warning that certain people who made trouble for the Beaumonts had a way of finding their small businesses inspected, their leases questioned, their lives made difficult, and that a wise woman would stay in her bakery and be grateful she still had one. Marvella read the message and smiled and made no reply. She had her invitation already. She had had it for weeks, because the 20th anniversary gala of Beaumont's restaurant was being held in the restaurant's own dining room, and the woman whose name was on the license had every legal right in the world to walk through that door. The night of the gala, it was raining. Of course it was raining. It had rained the night she arrived in this country 23 years ago, frightened and hopeful in a green wax print dress. It had rained the night they put her out. And now it came down in silver sheets on Aldwin and Ferris, on the old brass plaque worn nearly smooth, on the long line of black cars disgorging investors and councilmen and society colonists, under a canopy held by men in white gloves. Inside, Beaumont's blazed. 300 candles, white cloth and old silver, a string quartet, Vivian Beaumont in gray silk receiving guests at the door like a queen at a coronation, her smile beautiful and white and empty. Roland beside her in a good suit, already a little drunk, laughing too loudly at things that were not funny. And Celestine in a column of deep red, radiant, triumphant, moving through the room she believed she had finally completely won, with Anton Reyes at her elbow and a leather folder of papers waiting on a side table for the signatures that would, in 1 hour, make her a very rich and very free woman. Marvella arrived at 8:30, alone, in a dress the color of midnight. She did not come in the green of the frightened girl. She came in deep blue silk, her grandmother's gold at her throat, her head high, every inch of her steady and calm and quietly, devastatingly magnificent. She handed her invitation to the man at the door, and he checked the list, and his face did a small confused thing, and he let her pass, because the name on the card matched a name on the list, and the name on the card was the name on the deed. The room saw her before the family did. A ripple went through it, a turning of heads, a hush spreading out from the door like a stone dropped in still water. Is that? Surely not. The Okafor woman, the bakery, the one in the paper. And Marvella walked through the parting crowd, slowly, into the heart of the room she had saved and been thrown out of, and she let them look. Vivienne saw her and went the color of ash. Roland saw her and his glass stopped halfway to his mouth. And Celestine across the room turned and saw the village girl she had spent 11 years engineering out of existence, standing calm and crowned in the center of the family's triumph. And for one single, unguarded second, her beautiful face showed Marvella exactly what she had come to see: fear. Then the mask came down, smooth and bright, and Celestine swept toward her with both hands out and a voice like warm honey, loud enough for the room. "My goodness, what a surprise! I didn't realize you were, well, how kind of you to come and see the old place one last time before its new chapter. Are you here for the canapés?" A little laugh, an invitation to the room to laugh with her. "I'm afraid we're rather busy tonight, darling. Family business, you understand." A few people laughed, the old reflex, the help, making herself useful, here for the canapés. Marvella let the laughter come. She had learned long ago how to stand inside it. She waited until it ebbed, and then she spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, in the warm, steady voice that had once told a sweating young man at a trade conference that he looked like he'd never eaten properly in his life. "I'm not here for the canapés, Celestine," she said. "I'm here because you're about to sell something tonight." She let her gaze travel unhurried to the leather folder on the side table, and then to Anton Reyes, and then back. "And I think the buyer should probably know who actually owns it before he signs." The room went very quiet. Celestine recovered fast. She always did. The honey came back into her voice, but there was steel under it now, and her eyes had gone flat and hard. "I'm sorry," she said with a little laugh aimed at the watching room. "I don't think this is the place. Marvella, dear, you're clearly upset. 20 years is a long time, and endings are hard. No one blames you for feeling, but this is a private celebration, and you're embarrassing yourself. Someone will call you a car." She lifted a hand toward the men at the door. "Why don't we—" "Whose name is on the deed, Celestine?" Marvella said it quietly, but it landed in the silence like a glass dropped on marble, and Celestine's hand stopped in the air. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's a simple question." Marvella turned, unhurried, so that she was now speaking not only to Celestine, but to the room, to the investors, the councilmen, the 2 journalists who had stopped pretending to drink. "This is the 20th anniversary gala of Beaumont's restaurant, and in about an hour, this restaurant is going to be sold to Mr. Reyes here for a great deal of money. So it seems like a reasonable thing before that happens for everyone to be clear on a a single point. She let her gaze settle on Celestine, calm as deep water. Whose name is on the operating license? Whose name is on the deed? Who legally owns the thing you're about to sell? The family owns. No, try again. And then she did the thing she had been building toward for 3 years, brick by patient brick. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She reached into her midnight blue silk and drew out a single folded sheet of paper, old and soft at the creases, and she held it up where the candlelight could catch it. 18 years ago, she said, your sister handed me a stack of renewal forms and told me to make myself useful. The operating license for this restaurant had lapsed. Augustin was dead. The form would not process without a living name of record, and there was no one else there, and no one in this family has ever once read a document they handed to the help. Her voice stayed terribly even. So I signed it with the only name I had the authority to use, my own. A sound went through the room, low, disbelieving. For 18 years, Beaumont's restaurant has operated under a license held lawfully by Marvella Okafor. Every plate that left this kitchen, it left under my name. The doors you walk through cannot legally open without my name. And the thing you're about to sell tonight, Celestine, the thing this entire beautiful evening was built to sell, she let it land, is not yours to sell. It never was. You are about to sign a contract to deliver to Mr. Reyes a business whose proprietor of record is standing in front of you in a blue dress. She turned to Anton Reyes, who had gone very still, and held out a second document, crisp, official, stamped. This is a confirmation from the licensing authority dated this week. You're welcome to have your lawyer read it before you sign anything. I'd want to in your place. Reyes did not take it from her, but he looked at it, and then he looked slowly at Celestine, and something cold and dangerous moved behind his face, the face of a man who builds empires for a living and has just been told in front of 300 witnesses that he was about to pay a fortune for an empty room. Celestine, he said quietly, is this true? It's a clerical. It's a technicality. It's nothing. A clerk's error from 20 years ago. It can be corrected in an afternoon, Anton. You cannot possibly take the word of a bakery woman over. Then there's the other matter, Marvella said, and the room which had thought the worst was over leaned in. Because a license can be argued over. Lawyers love a license, but the rest of it? She drew out the old folder now, Adeline's folder, thick with 3 years of patient work. The Reyes deal isn't what this family thinks it is. 3 of the 4 Beaumonts in this room believe the money's going to be split fairly. It isn't. She looked at Vivian, gone gray by the door, and at Roland, frozen, glass forgotten in his hand. The sister you trust was never protecting the family. She was selling it out from under all of you and keeping it. Roland's mouth opened. No sound came. He turned slowly to look at Celestine, and the look on his face was the look of a man watching the floor of his own house fall away. "That's a lie," Celestine said, but her voice had climbed, thin and shrill now, and people were stepping back from her. "That is a vicious, jealous lie from a bitter woman who—" "And then," said a new voice, clear and cold from the doorway, "there's me." The room turned. Seraphine Lal stood in the entrance in a gown the color of old bone. 2 years of being called a liar burned out of her now, replaced by something straight-backed and luminous and terrible. She walked into the candlelight, and Anton Reyes made a small, wounded sound, and Celestine's last ounce of color drained away entirely. "Most of you know me," Seraphine said to the room, "or you knew me before this woman," she did not look at Celestine, she did not need to, "decided I was inconvenient. I was engaged to Anton for 2 years. Celestine took him to close her deal. She told me herself once when she thought I was too broken to ever be believed. She seduced him as a term of the contract, and then she made sure no one in this city would ever take my word over hers about anything. Her voice did not shake. I've waited 2 years for one person to believe me. Tonight, I brought proof, and I am no longer alone. She crossed the room and stood beside Marvella, the two of them together now, the bakery woman in midnight blue and the ruined bride in bone, two victims of the same cold hand, side by side in the heart of the room that was supposed to have been Celestine's coronation. And the thing about a moment built loudly in front of important people, the thing Celestine herself had understood so well, is that it cuts both ways. She had wanted 300 witnesses to make her triumph impossible to undo. Now there were 300 witnesses to her ruin, and not one of them would ever be able to pretend they hadn't seen. It came apart very quickly after that, the way a thing comes apart when only fear was holding it together. Anton Reyes did not sign. He gathered the leather folder off the side table himself, closed it, and handed it to his lawyer without a word, and the sale, the 11-year sale, the fortune, the whole engine of the evening, was simply, suddenly, dead. Within a week, his attorneys had begun the fraud filings because Anton Reyes was not a man who forgave being made a fool of in public, and Celestine had made him one in front of the entire city. The notary's statement and Adeline's letter and the forged authorizations did the rest. There was an investigation. The forged partnership documents, the ones Roland had signed believing they tidied the family's holdings, became evidence. And the deeper papers, the ones Celestine had kept even from her own family, became evidence. And the holding company built to swallow the money became the thing that swallowed Celestine. She was expelled from the business she had spent her life clawing toward. She faced charges, the red dress, the radiance, the 11 patient years, all of it collapsed into lawyers and depositions, and a name that this city became a thing people said with a lowered voice. Vivian, image-obsessed Vivian, who had built her whole self on what the right people thought, lived to watch the right people stop returning her calls. The gray house on Vautrin Hill went quiet, then went on the market, then went to strangers. There would be no monument to the Beaumonts after all, no legacy preserved, no painted fifth generation to smell something faintly unpleasant from the wall. The name simply faded off the worn brass plaque the way Vivian had once predicted it would for lack of an heir, though not at all in the way she had meant. And Roland did not lose the most in money, but he lost the thing he had spent his whole life avoiding having to face, the knowledge that his silence had never been peace, that it had only ever been cowardice with better manners, and that the wife he had let his family throw in the rain had been the one person in 20 years who would have stood between him and the people who used him. He fell apart slowly. He drank. The marriage to the family was over the night the marriage to Marvella had ended 3 years before. He simply hadn't known the first one was ending too. He was last seen in the rumor that reached Marvella months later, in a far smaller place than he had ever imagined for himself, asking people who barely remembered him whether they'd heard what had happened to the restaurant. Marvella did not go to watch any of it. She heard it all the way you hear weather in another country, as rumor, as passing word, as a thing that happened far away to people she used to know. Because the night of the gala, once it was done, once Anton had gone and Seraphine had been believed at last, and the room had dissolved into the low roar of 300 people who knew they had witnessed something, Marvella did not stay to be congratulated. She did not make a speech on justice. She folded her 2 documents back into the old soft folder, and she looked one last time around the dining room she had quietly saved for 20 years and been thrown out of for her trouble. Then she walked out the front door of Beaumont's, past the worn brass plaque, into the silver rain. It had been raining the night she arrived in this country, frightened and hopeful in a green dress. It had been raining the night they put her out. It was raining now. But she stood under the canopy on Aldwyn and Ferris, and she felt none of the things she had thought across 3 years that she might feel. No triumph, no fire, no urge to look back through the lit windows at the family coming apart inside. Only a great, clean, settled calm. Only quiet. Only the particular peace of a woman who has finally set down a weight she has been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was part of her body. She took out her phone, there in the rain, and she found Roland's number, the number she had somehow never deleted in 3 years, the last thread to 20 years of a life, and she looked at it for a moment without feeling much of anything at all. Then she deleted it, a small thing, a single tap, the thread gone. She put the phone away, she pulled her coat close, and she stepped out from under the canopy into the rain on her own toward the lights of the city. Her city, the one she had fed in the dark for 20 years, and now, at last, in her own name. There was an early shift waiting. The old coal-black oven would need firing by 5. The Saturday line would form by 8, and they would say her name when they ordered the 2 date loaves. Okafor's, please, and it would be hers. Every warm, cardamom-scented inch of it, hers. Marvella Okafor walked into the rain, and she did not look back. And somewhere behind her, a cold, proud house finished falling down. The end. I keep thinking about the 2 of them. The woman who built an 11-year plan to bury someone, and the man who simply looked at his plate and let her. One of them was the architect, the other only ever stayed silent. And I genuinely don't know which one did Marvella the deeper harm. The cold, patient cruelty that schemed against her for over a decade, or the cowardly quiet of the man who loved her once and still couldn't bring himself to say stop. Maybe silence, when it comes from someone who could have protected you, is its own kind of betrayal. The slow kind, the kind that doesn't even have the courage to look you in the eye. What do you think? Which is worse? The one who plans your ruin, or the one who watches it happen and says nothing? Let me know down in the comments and tell me where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If this one moved you, a super thanks genuinely helps keep these stories coming, and it means more than you know. And if you want 2 more like this one, watch the story of the housekeeper who turned out to own the estate coming up on screen now, and the one about the discarded first wife who came back as the company's largest shareholder. I think you'll love them both. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and I'll see you in the next story.